This week, we saw Nintendo release 15 games for the Game Boy Color, and the Game Boy Advance on their Nintendo Switch Online subscription service. We've already talked about the 6 Game Boy Advance titles and the 5 games released on the black and white Game Boy. So now it's time to complete the trilogy with the Game Boy Color. If you're a Nintendo Switch Online subscriber, then you can download 4 Game Boy Color games right now, including The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening DX, Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare, Game & Watch Gallery 3, and Wario Land 3. Those are some big hitters, but are any of them actually worth playing? To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Nintendo Power, Computer and Video Games, and more classic magazines to see what the critics said back when these games first came out. Nope, your eyes are not deceiving you, because this is another packed episode of Nintendo Switch Online Review Crew, now in color.
America the Beautiful Game Boy Color.
Get into it.
At first glance, Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare seems like a weird choice for the Nintendo Switch Online service. For one thing, it's one of the very few games to not come from Nintendo, and it's widely considered to be the worst version of this Alone in the Dark reboot, a game that was already a little iffy to begin with. However, let me make the argument for The New Nightmare. While it's true that this stripped-down handheld version basically slices and dices the original to shreds, it's also an impressive use of the limited and outdated hardware. Alone in the Dark somehow manages to keep the pre-rendered backgrounds and general atmosphere from the original, which is not easy to do on a handheld, let me tell you. And as a survival horror game, it feels like it's a world away from the rest of the platformers and adventure games that we get on Nintendo Switch Online. Even if it's not the best game that we're going to be talking about today, I like that it was added to the collection. Unfortunately, there just aren't a whole lot of reviews for Alone in the Dark: The New Nightmare. If an outlet was going to review this game, it was going to be on a home console, not the stripped-down handheld version. One of the reviews comes from Game Informer, who ended up giving the survival horror game a so-so 7.5 out of 10. They praised the impressive presentation and sound design. Nintendo Power, on the other hand, was not as generous. They gave it a 2.5 out of 5, complaining that there's not a whole lot of game here. Chris argued that it's really just a vehicle for some of the most impressive backgrounds ever on Game Boy, while Drew noted that it plays like a slideshow and the hero looks like Cornelius from Planet of the Apes. Now hang on, wait a second here, that's going too far. You can hate on this game all you want, but Edward Carnby does not look like one of those damn dirty apes. If you were to tell me that Nintendo chose their Game Boy Color games by randomly pulling boxes out of a burlap sack, you know what? I'd probably believe you. How else are you going to explain starting with Game & Watch Gallery 3? Not that it's a bad game or anything, but is this really the entry in the series that you want people to start with? Well, I think we can all agree that that's certainly a baffling decision. It shouldn't take anything away from this fun compilation. It collects some of Nintendo's best-loved Game & Watch games from back in the day, now with a fresh makeover complete with color graphics. While this may be the first Game & Watch title on the Switch, you can see some series fatigue bleeding into these old-school reviews. I mean, Electronic Gaming Monthly literally started their review by saying, simply put, this Game & Watch compilation is the same old, same old. And that's okay. Each minigame in the cart features a modern and classic version in addition to the little extra features. It's perfect on the Game Boy Color. EGM gave the game an 8 out of 10. That's pretty much the same score that we saw from N64 Magazine, which gave the game a solid 4 out of 5. Total Game Boy went a little higher, giving it an 85%. However, the lowest score that I could find came from an unlikely source, Nintendo Power, giving it a 6.8 out of 10. They liked the enhanced graphics that take them beyond the realm of curiosities with nostalgic value. Although all 5 titles are fairly simple, they provide a lot of entertainment value. Though, just to be clear, it's not enough entertainment value to score the game above a 6.8. I'm just saying.
The Game Boy Play It Loud series. What color is yours?
Alright, now that we've gotten Game & Watch and Alone in the Dark out of the way, it's time to finally talk about the reason that you're here. The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening DX. This is one of 2 Zelda games that were released this week, but don't let this 8-bit version get overshadowed by the flashier Minish Cap, because Link's Awakening is still an amazing game. It's full of all the items, secrets, bosses, and fun that you'd expect from an overhead Zelda game. And best of all, this version of the game is in color. Even though this DX version of the game was little more than a port with a fresh coat of paint, the critics still ate it up. Electronic Gaming Monthly gave it a 9.25 out of 10, making it their 5th best reviewed game on either the Game Boy or the Game Boy Color. John Davison had an interesting comparison. This is the handheld gaming equivalent of the Star Wars Special Edition when you think about it. A classic game, which still has no equal, brought up to date to take advantage of more modern technology. And with some extra bits, too. John Riccardi also loved the game, arguing that Link's Awakening still reigns supreme as the best Game Boy game available. Be warned though, aside from the beautiful colored graphics and a slightly updated ending, Zelda DX isn't all that different from the original game. Obviously, it wasn't just EGM that loved Link's Awakening DX, as you saw Total Game Boy give it a 95%, one of their highest scores. Nintendo Power ended up giving the game an 8.8 out of 10, which was exactly the same score that they gave the original black and white version. Now, Computer and Video Games ended up giving the game the highest score, a perfect 5 out of 5. They note that these set pieces are all based on classic Zelda themes. The new dungeon, whose theme is color, can only be accessed if you have a Game Boy Color. It's not so amazing, but it adds a cool extra feature to the game if you complete it, which is easy. Overall, a great game. Though, you need to be a Zelda diehard to own both the color and black and white versions just for the extra dungeon. Thankfully, you don't have to worry about any of that when you're enjoying this Nintendo classic on the Switch. After making his first appearance in Super Mario Land 2, 6 Golden Coins, Wario ended up stealing the franchise away from Mario with his own Wario Land games. What's odd is that Nintendo chose to not start with the brilliant original when bringing the series to the Switch, but rather skipped right to Wario Land 3 for some reason. Look, don't get me wrong, Wario Land 3 is great and it still holds up remarkably well. But come on, why skip right past Wario Land 1 and 2? Again, it's like they just pulled these titles out of a burlap bag. Alright, let's just choose to ignore the randomness of the releases and instead focus on the reviews, which were all overwhelmingly positive for Wario Land 3. Electronic Gaming Monthly, for example, gave it an average score of 9 out of 10. Sean started his review with a really dumb question. Is it wrong for a grown man to be in love with a video game? Of course not. I'm proud to be smitten by Wario Land 3. With tons of items, coins, power-ups, and more to collect, dozens of innovative puzzles to figure out, and old-school levels to go back and forth between, what's not to love? One thing to note, it's more of a sit-at-home-and-play kind of game rather than something you take on vacation. Greg agreed, noting that it's odd to see a great game on the Game Boy that isn't a remake or adaptation of a classic NES or PlayStation game lately. I love the whole impossible-to-die setup of this game. It requires the player to think outside the box. You can't just go from point A to point B, but you need to consider the effects each enemy's attack has on Wario and use the subsequent abilities that he gains to find hidden areas in each stage. Over at Nintendo Power, the critics were overall impressed with Wario Land 3, but definitely not as enthusiastic as EGM. Giving it an 8.2 out of 10, Kyle notes that it has a pleasing retro feel and holds up a new standard of quality and depth on the Game Boy Color. Chris liked that the progressive play control is a neat way to extend gameplay and the levels are magnificent, while Jennifer sarcastically asked, "Mario who?" They loved the graphics, but were disappointed by the music and the sound effects, something that likely lowered the score a little bit. Personally speaking, I think you should probably play the Wario Land games in order. But look, if you're a Nintendo Switch Online subscriber, I'm definitely not gonna stop you from jumping straight to Wario Land 3. It's pretty great. Hey, thanks for watching me talk about these classic Game Boy Color reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we've already covered the Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance games that hit the Nintendo Switch Online. In fact, we post one of these episodes every time Nintendo adds classic games to their subscription service. So do me a favor and check out the full playlist for more old school reviews. Now, here's the question I have for you. What are your thoughts about this Game Boy Color selection? Are there any Game Boy Color games that you want to see added in the coming months? Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we're going to be back next week with all the reviews that I was going to run this week, including Hitman, World of Assassination, that new Wonder Boy collection, something called the Redress of Mira, and more. That'll be a nice change of pace after all of these Game Boy reviews. If that sounds good to you, then I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.